The roots of the Second World War can be traced directly to the aftermath of the First World War. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe penalties on Germany, forcing it to accept full responsibility for the war, surrender territory, drastically reduce its military, and pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers. The treaty left the German economy in shambles and created a climate of deep national resentment. Many Germans viewed the treaty not as a peace settlement, but as a national humiliation designed to keep their country weak and divided. The economic burden placed on Germany after the First World War contributed to a period of severe inflation, political instability, and social unrest throughout the 1920s. Middle-class families saw their life savings disappear overnight, and millions of people lost their jobs. In this environment of despair and uncertainty, radical ideologies began to gain traction. Political extremists promised solutions to Germany's problems and laid blame on outside forces, such as international bankers, communists, and the Allied powers. One of the most prominent voices to emerge during this period was that of Adolf Hitler, the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party. Hitler's powerful speeches and propaganda campaigns exploited the economic hardship and national shame felt by many Germans. He promised to rebuild the economy, restore German pride, and overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. His ideas appealed to millions, and by the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had become one of the most powerful political forces in Germany. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. Within months, he used the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act to consolidate his power and establish a dictatorship. Civil liberties were suspended, rival political parties were banned, and the press was brought under state control. Hitler established the Gestapo, a secret police force tasked with eliminating dissent, and began implementing his vision of a racially pure German state based on Aryan supremacy. Meanwhile, Italy faced its own post-war turmoil. Despite fighting on the side of the Allies, Italy emerged from the First World War with few rewards. Economic hardship, political chaos, and a sense of betrayal gave rise to Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement. In 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome and was granted power by King Victor Emmanuel III. Once in control, Mussolini dismantled democratic institutions, established a police state, and promoted aggressive nationalism under the banner of a revived Roman Empire. In Asia, Japan pursued its own expansionist goals. Faced with limited natural resources and growing population pressures, Japan began to seek new territory on the Asian mainland. In 1931, Japanese troops staged an incident on the South Manchurian Railway and used it as a pretext to invade Manchuria. The invasion was swift and successful, leading to the creation of a puppet state called Manchukuo. Although the League of Nations condemned the invasion, it took no meaningful action, and Japan withdrew from the organization in defiance. The League of Nations had been created after the First World War to promote peace and collective security, but its weakness quickly became apparent. It lacked a standing military force and depended on its member states to enforce decisions. In cases like Japan's aggression in Manchuria or Italy's future invasion of Ethiopia, the League proved unable or unwilling to act. This encouraged authoritarian leaders to believe they could expand their territories without facing serious consequences from the international community. In 1935, Hitler openly defied the Treaty of Versailles by announcing the reintroduction of compulsory military service and unveiling the existence of a new German air force, the Luftwaffe. The following year, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone bordering France. Despite this blatant violation of the treaty, France and Britain failed to respond militarily. Their policy of appeasement, aimed at avoiding another devastating war, only emboldened Hitler to pursue more aggressive actions. Italy followed Germany's example of territorial expansion by launching an invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The Italian military used tanks, aircraft, and poison gas against poorly equipped Ethiopian forces. Although the League of Nations imposed limited economic sanctions on Italy, they were not enforced effectively. By 1936, Mussolini had successfully annexed Ethiopia and declared the creation of a new Italian empire. This marked a clear victory for fascism and a failure for collective international resistance. In July of 1936, civil war erupted in Spain between the elected Republican government and a group of nationalist rebels led by General Francisco Franco. Germany and Italy supported Franco with weapons, soldiers, and aircraft, using the conflict as a proving ground for new military tactics and technology. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans with arms and advisors, while Western democracies largely stayed out of the conflict. The Spanish Civil War became a symbolic struggle between fascism and democracy, and it served as a grim preview of the broader war to come. In 1937, Japan escalated its aggression in Asia by launching a full-scale invasion of China. The Second Sino-Japanese War began with brutal campaigns in northern China and culminated in the infamous Nanjing Massacre. Japanese troops killed tens of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war in a campaign of terror and destruction. Once again, international condemnation failed to produce meaningful intervention. Japan continued its expansion into central and southern China, solidifying its status as a major military power in the Pacific. In March of 1938, Hitler turned his attention to Austria. Claiming to protect ethnic Germans and promote unity, he orchestrated a political crisis and pressured the Austrian government into allowing German troops to enter the country. The annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, was met with cheering crowds in Vienna and little resistance from other nations. Austria was absorbed into the Third Reich, and once again, Britain and France did nothing to stop the aggression. After the successful annexation of Austria, Hitler set his sights on the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. He demanded its transfer to Germany, arguing that ethnic Germans were being mistreated. The crisis escalated quickly and war seemed imminent. In September of 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders met with Hitler in Munich to negotiate a settlement. They agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial demands. The Munich Agreement was hailed by Chamberlain as a triumph of diplomacy, and he famously declared that it had secured peace for their time. In reality, the agreement was a clear example of appeasement and a catastrophic misjudgment of Hitler's ambitions. Czechoslovakia was not consulted during the talks and was forced to surrender its most fortified and industrialized regions. The loss left the country vulnerable and demoralized. Hitler, emboldened by the ease of his victories, began planning further expansion. In March of 1939, only 6 months after the Munich Agreement, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This action proved that Hitler's intentions extended far beyond uniting ethnic Germans. The occupation marked the first time Nazi Germany had taken control of non-German territory. Britain and France were shocked and finally recognized that appeasement had failed. They began preparing for war and offered security guarantees to Poland, the next likely target of German aggression. By the spring of 1939, Hitler began making demands for the return of Danzig, a port city that had been placed under international control after the First World War. He also demanded the creation of a corridor connecting mainland Germany to the separated province of East Prussia. Poland refused these demands, and Britain and France made it clear that they would defend Polish sovereignty. Hitler faced the possibility of a two-front war, which had been disastrous for Germany in the past. To avoid this situation, Hitler turned to the Soviet Union. Despite their ideological differences, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939. The agreement stunned the world, as the two countries had been bitter enemies. The pact included a secret protocol to divide Eastern Europe between them, including the partition of Poland. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler now felt confident to proceed with his plans for invasion. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland using a new style of warfare known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The strategy involved fast-moving tank divisions, coordinated airstrikes, and overwhelming force intended to break enemy lines quickly. Polish defenses were caught off guard, and major cities like Warsaw came under heavy bombardment. Thousands of civilians were killed in the opening days of the campaign, and chaos spread across the country. 2 days after the invasion, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Despite their declaration, neither country launched immediate military operations to assist Poland. The early days of the Second World War were marked by the rapid fall of Polish defenses and the brutal treatment of civilians by German forces. It became clear that this war would not resemble the drawn-out trench warfare of the past. While German forces pressed deep into Poland from the west, the Soviet Union launched its own invasion from the east on September 17, 1939. Acting under the terms of the secret protocol in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Soviet troops quickly occupied eastern Polish territories. The Polish military, already overwhelmed by the German assault, stood no chance against two invading powers. Within weeks, Poland was completely divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and the Polish government fled into exile. The occupation of Poland marked the beginning of widespread atrocities and repression. In the German zone, Jews were forced into ghettos, Polish officials and intellectuals were executed, and entire communities were destroyed. The Nazi regime began implementing racial policies intended to eliminate what they called inferior populations. In the Soviet zone, thousands of Polish officers and political leaders were arrested or deported to labor camps. Both regimes used terror and violence to crush resistance and assert control. The fall of Poland shocked the world, but also revealed serious flaws in Allied strategy. Despite declaring war, Britain and France had no plan to assist Poland directly. Their forces remained behind defensive lines, waiting for a German attack that never came during those early months. This period became known as the Phony War, a strange lull in the conflict during which little fighting occurred on the Western Front. Yet behind the scenes, both sides were preparing for a much larger confrontation. Hitler used this time to consolidate power and plan the next phase of his campaign. He ordered the expansion of German military production and began developing plans to invade Western Europe. The Nazi propaganda machine presented the invasion of Poland as a defensive action and portrayed Germany as a victim of international aggression. Meanwhile, anti-Semitic policies were intensified, and the German public was gradually conditioned to accept harsher measures against Jews and other targeted groups. In the occupied Polish territories, the German regime began constructing a system of concentration camps. These facilities were initially used for political prisoners, but they soon evolved into centers of mass detention and forced labor. The first major camp, Auschwitz, would later become a symbol of the Holocaust. German authorities also began compiling lists of Jewish residents, enforcing identity badges, and instituting laws that restricted their movement and access to basic services. In the Soviet zone, mass arrests and deportations were carried out by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Entire families were sent to labor camps in Siberia under suspicion of being enemies of the state. Soviet authorities also carried out the Katyn massacre in 1940, executing over 20,000 Polish military officers and intellectuals. These actions remained a secret for decades, but demonstrated the brutality with which Stalin intended to control Eastern Europe. While Europe held its breath, Germany turned its attention northward. In April of 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway in a surprise operation. Denmark surrendered within hours, while Norway offered more resistance but was ultimately defeated. The campaign secured Germany's access to important naval bases and iron ore shipments from Sweden. The rapid success of the northern invasions further cemented the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics. With northern Europe under control, Hitler prepared to strike at France. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Low Countries and France. German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by advancing through Belgium and Luxembourg. Using fast-moving tank units and coordinated air attacks, German troops overwhelmed Allied defenses and pushed deep into French territory. Within weeks, German soldiers were at the gates of Paris. The fall of France came faster than anyone had expected. British and French forces attempted to mount a defense, but their outdated tactics and poor coordination left them vulnerable to German maneuver warfare. By late May, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. In a desperate effort, Britain launched Operation Dynamo, evacuating over 300,000 soldiers across the English Channel under constant enemy fire. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris, and on June 22nd, France formally surrendered. The country was divided into two zones, the German-occupied north and the Vichy regime in the south, which collaborated with the Nazis. The fall of France was a devastating blow to the Allies and left Britain standing alone against the Axis powers. Hitler believed the war in Western Europe was won and shifted focus toward his next goal. As the war spread across Europe, Italy joined the conflict on the side of Germany. Mussolini declared war on France and Britain in June of 1940, hoping to gain territorial rewards. Italian forces launched offensives in North Africa and the Balkans, but were met with limited success. Although Germany was dominating the war on land, Italy's military performance exposed serious weaknesses and forced Hitler to divert resources to support his ally. Back in Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned following the collapse of France. He was replaced by Winston Churchill, who vowed to continue the fight no matter the cost. Churchill's speeches rallied the British people during the darkest days of the war. With Germany preparing for an invasion, the Battle of Britain was about to begin, marking a new chapter in the global conflict. Despite Hitler's dominance in Europe, resistance movements began to form in occupied countries. Underground groups in Poland, France, and other territories conducted sabotage operations, spread anti-Nazi propaganda, and gathered intelligence for the Allies. These movements kept hope alive for millions under occupation and would play a vital role in the long-term struggle against tyranny. The opening year of the Second World War had already witnessed dramatic shifts in power and territory. The Nazi war machine had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France in a matter of months. The Soviet Union had expanded its influence in Eastern Europe and demonstrated its willingness to use force to suppress opposition. The old order of Europe had collapsed, and a new era of brutal, total war had begun. Although Britain had survived the initial wave, it now stood alone in Western Europe. The threat of German invasion loomed large, and British cities would soon face devastating bombing campaigns. Yet Britain's resolve did not break. With support from its empire and a growing alliance with the United States, Britain prepared to resist and continue the fight. The alliances and rivalries formed during this period would shape the rest of the war. Germany, Italy, and Japan formalized their partnership as the Axis powers, while Britain sought allies across the globe. The Soviet Union remained officially neutral with Germany, but would soon face betrayal. The seeds of global conflict had been sown, and every major continent would soon be drawn into the war. By the end of 1940, it was clear that the Second World War would not be a short or limited conflict. The strategies, ideologies, and weapons used during the first year revealed the scale of destruction that lay ahead. Civilian populations had already begun to suffer under occupation, and the boundaries between military and civilian targets were quickly dissolving. The world had entered a new phase of warfare, where speed, technology, and ideology would determine the fate of nations. The lessons of the First World War had been ignored or forgotten, and the promise of lasting peace had vanished. As bombs fell, governments collapsed, and armies marched across borders. The world braced for what would become the most devastating conflict in human history. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. This has been our first episode in our World War II series. Many more to come.